Welcome to Beyond Belief, Tales of Religious Exodus, where we delve into the personal journeys of people who've left fundamentalist religions. In this series, we explore their experiences within religion, their journey out, and how they found meaning and healing on the other side.
Mike, welcome to the podcast. The goal is to eventually interview all my siblings. You have the privilege of being one of the first, so it's good to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'll take second.
I'm slightly offended that you didn't make yourself the first.
Fair enough.
So as long as we're all offended, I'd love to hear, you and I have chatted often off screen about a lot of this, but I'd be curious to hear in your words how you describe your upbringing. How would you describe the religious environment that you were raised in?
Yeah, and it's intertwined and also separate, which is an interesting thing I think we've spoken about before, where a lot of the pain and the trauma came straight from the religion. But in terms of it's ultra-orthodox Judaism, very strict, very black and white, literally black and white, and also metaphorically black and white. Everything is binary. You have to do certain things. You're not allowed to do other things. And so it was an incredibly repressive environment. And, for example, the schools that we went to, we didn't get any secular education almost at all. We got some very basic math during elementary. And even that, no one took seriously. So really, there was an exclusive focus on studying the scriptures, and you're doing God's will, and there's a vision for what your future needs to look like. And anything outside of that is complete no-go. And so there wasn't, really any room for individuality in that space. You need to fit into the cookie cutter that's there. And so, very, very, very stifling environment. I think especially for us, where there's so much creativity in our family and so much expression that wants to come out. And so there's something extra tragic about the fact that as very creative kids and very inquisitive and curious kids, we had no opportunity to move into any of that because the environment that we were in just did not foster that at all. I shouldn't say no opportunity, because I actually really appreciate the fact that our parents still encouraged us to pick up a musical instrument. It's actually pretty meaningful. And especially in that environment where it wasn't, the fact that they still said, hey, you guys should play an instrument. So you played the guitar, I played the drums. And looking back, I think that was a really meaningful outlet for me. So they tried to do a little more of it than the world that we were in allowed for, but it was still very much, and mostly we were supposed to just be good religious kids and do what we're supposed to do and stay out of trouble.
Yeah. Why do you think that they did some amount of it? Why weren't they completely in line with exactly the black and white world?
It's a great question. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, but I know I'm being interviewed here, so I don't get to ask.
At the end.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
I think part of it is because it was a mixed culture thing, because they didn't grow up religious themselves and they came into that world. I think they ended up bringing some of their own upbringing into that in a way I think that was great. I think that's good that happened. So as much as they tried to fully convert to the Orthodox way of being, I don't think they were ever able to fully do that. And so we grew up in this very weird environment where we had a weirdly American cultural home in a completely Israeli ultra-Orthodox context. There's a very weird mix of things where we grew up in it. We would watch, classically American films like Chitty Chitty Bang Bang and Oliver Twist. And we had Playmobil and Lego at home. And we would listen to English music, and we spoke English at home. And so there was compared to our friends in class, we were totally culturally diverse, right? Compared to the rest of the world, it was still so minimal. But I think in my mind, the big reason that was happening is because, yes, they grew up in a completely secular environment. And I think they ended up still bringing some of that into the way they raised us, even though on paper, some of that stuff wasn't totally kosher.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I'm curious, continuing the previous line of thought, were there particular laws that messed with you in particular that you remember struggling with, or maybe that you still struggle with?
One big one that comes to mind immediately is just the prohibitions around certain types of sexual expression, right? And so masturbation is a huge no-no, big no-no. And as a teenage boy, it's a very natural urge. And so that created a huge psychological conflict. On the one hand, feeling powerful urge to do certain things. And then on the other hand, having this framework that tells you that it's essentially akin to murder. Yeah, I remember encountering a scripture that talks about how you meet all of the kids that you killed in heaven or hell, wherever you end up, I guess, depending based on your masturbation account, essentially, right? So every time you masturbate, something along those lines. I don't remember the details exactly, but it was absolutely horrifying, terrifying, and even if you don't believe it fully, believing it 10% is enough to create a total mind fuck, right? Where you're not necessarily going to stop doing it because it's such a primal urge. You're just going to do it and then feel a perfect cocktail of guilt and shame and terror and fear, which only leads you to do it again because you want to avoid all those negative emotions. And then you feel even, so it's a real, real soup of negativity that ends up created there for no reason but the fact that there's a ridiculous prohibition around expressing yourself sexually, right?
Yeah. Side anecdote, based on what you're saying, that belief of encountering those people you've killed is so strong and so ingrained. I don't know if you know this law, that in Jerusalem, relatives of the deceased don't go to the graveyard because supposedly they'll encounter the demons of the person that has the dead babies. Basically will see the live children of the person and be like, what, why did they get to be alive and we're not? And so you're antagonizing it, essentially. This is why when our grandfather died, our grandmother was not allowed to go to the graveyard. She literally did not go to the burial. So it's right there in the law system.
Wow, I had no idea about that. And this is why I love conversations like this, is because it's crazy that there's still areas and corners that I might know about that you might not, and vice versa. And it's always so interesting to discover. Yeah, that is totally new to me.
Yeah, it's specifically in Jerusalem. It's an extra stringent, like many things in Jerusalem that are like
Because
worse than
it's
everywhere else.
a holy place.
I don't know what it is. It's a holy place, but it's also like Jerusalem has a particular insular community. So they came up, it's like spawning its own version of extra intensity. So they ended up with all these traditions that even the rest of Orthodox Jews in the rest of the world would be like, what? That's crazy. So they've managed to exceed even Orthodox Judaism's expectations in how they function. Yeah. So I guess continuing in that line, you're raised extremely oppressed in the home, out of the home, all these oppressive laws. I guess the question I'm curious about is, was there a point when like cracks began to form, or if we even go earlier back, for a long time, were you completely bought in to the system, essentially?
It's an interesting question in my case. And I've thought a lot about it looking back, because my arc was interesting in the sense that I was bought in, but I've come to recognize that I was not necessarily bought in as some other people. Not that I was actively doubting. I just think it was some sort of latent doubt that was just there that I wouldn't have even had the language for it. It just didn't smell right. So I think I had a few years in my teenagehood. First off, let me just backtrack. When I was a kid, I was bought in for sure. Up until probably 12, 13, I was bought in. You're a kid. You get told what's true. You believe it. No ambiguity there. And in fact, I think you touched upon this with Sim, the fear around being bar mitzvahed, right? That's something I very much experienced because I believed it. And if you believe it, it's a terrifying prospect. But then when I was in my teenage years, I think I had a few years between 13 and about 16, 17, where I wasn't actively doubting intellectually, but I just stopped doing a lot of things. For example, the wraps that you put on every day, which for ultra-orthodox male is very central to what you need to do. It's one of the big things, along wearing a kippah and wearing tzitzis and a few other things. It's considered a pretty big deal. And I stopped doing that like around for maybe 2 years, just stopped. And it wasn't well thought out. I was nowhere near the point of declaring myself an atheist or anything like that. I just stopped. And it wasn't a big deal for me emotionally. It just was like, oh, I guess I'm not doing this ridiculous thing now. It was a weird mix because I was still keeping Shabbat and I was still following a lot of the other rules, but I just stopped putting on tefillin. And I just did that for a while. Looking back, I think there was something interesting going on there where I wasn't fully bought in, but I also wasn't out. I was just in some sort of limbo. And then around 17 is when it really hit. Questions started coming. It's almost like my brain needed that one extra neuron or something. And then it's like, okay, question time. Because it really came out of nowhere. It wasn't like facilitated by a conversation with a friend or something. It was just one day, questions, questions, questions. And that led to a pretty intense journey of, I started asking the questions in yeshiva. I was in this very classically ultra-orthodox yeshiva in Har Nof. And I started asking very basic questions like, how do I know that God exists? And they had absolutely no idea how to deal with me because they are so ill-equipped for questions that basic. I was so far out of the range of the types of questions that they tend to get. They were paralyzed. They didn't know what to do. They're like, what do we do with this kid? And I was very sincere in my questions. I wasn't trying to cause problems. I was genuinely like, I want to know why I should believe this, right? And so quickly, I still remember the conversation I had with the Rosh Yeshiva, who was like a big deal over there. And I got pulled into his office and had a conversation with him individually. And he was like, yeah, you gotta go, right? Like you gotta step away, figure this stuff out. And then if you've figured it out, you can come back. So I ended up spending months at Aish, which is the organization that our parents were involved in. And Abba, our dad, connected me with all of the hotshot rabbis who are equipped to take questions. That's their professional duty, is to engage with questions. And so I was having these one-on-one meetings with all these big name rabbis. And essentially the whole idea was they'll answer my questions. I'll realize that I was wrong, get me back in yeshiva, and that'll be a little hiccup in my journey, right? That was the intention there. There wasn't real openness to my questions. It was pseudo openness. Let's engage in these enough so that he just gets back in line. But that's not how it happened. I ended up spending that time talking to rabbis. Also, I was reading books on the side, watching videos and stuff from the classic, the new atheists. There's Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, and Christopher Hitchens. And it became clear pretty quickly to me that it was total BS. The answers I was getting from these rabbis were so unsatisfactory to me. And I'm 17 at the time. It was a matter of a few months before I was officially out of the closet as an atheist. And then it was a completely new chapter for me. But that period out for me was incredibly intellectual. I never fit in yeshiva. I wasn't happy. So there was a bunch of emotional stuff. But really what led me out was realizing that there are not good reasons to believe this stuff. And there are very good reasons to doubt it. And once that hit me like a lightning bolt, that was it. The clarity around that was so evident to me. And as you might imagine, people were not super happy with this turn of events. But that's kind of my journey. I still remember watching I watched a debate. I think it was Sam Harris debating some like William Lane Craig or something, some Christian theologian. I remember watching the debate and having that feeling of like, oh, that feeling you get when something clicks and you're like, yes, of course. That was the feeling for me of encountering these atheist thinkers. It was almost like feeling like I was just waiting my whole life to hear this stuff. It was very immediate for me to realize, oh, wow. And so when I say it took a few months, it actually didn't take a few months. It happened a lot quicker than that. The few months was really just the process of doing the thing of talking to all the rabbis just to dot the I's. But really, I think it was pretty immediate for me once I encountered atheism to realize, yeah, I'm an atheist. So.
Yeah, I love that. And, I wouldn't ask this of everybody. I think your journey was particularly, I'll call it meticulous. It was like very step by step. It was very, like you said, dotting the I's. I guess out of curiosity, if you had to pick one argument against the existence of God or something either other people should hear or something that really resonated with you, what would be your main pillars of it?
I actually think that even the way the question is framed, I feel like is not how I would approach it, because to me, you don't need arguments against the existence of God. You just need to realize that every single argument for the existence of God is terrible, right? The burden of proof is on the believers. They're making the pretty radical claim, right? There's a God, and not only is there a God, he gave us a book that tells us how to live. That's a pretty substantial claim. So the burden of proof is on them to convince me of that. And what happened at the time, it's not that I found like knockdown arguments against that. It's just I realized that every single argument for it was really bad. And that just leaves it as a non-existent belief, right? If you're going to make a crazy claim and you don't have reasons for it, I'm just not going to believe it. And this gets into, there's a whole debate about whether atheism is believing that God doesn't exist or not believing that God exists, right?
Where agnosticism lives.
Exactly. And I tend to favor, at least how I identify, is not that I believe that God doesn't exist. I just don't believe that God exists. That resonates more, because I don't need to have a belief about something not existing. To me, I just need to not buy into it. I think what happened at the time is I realized that the knockdown arguments that each had the set of, that I know you're familiar with, they had this set of, there are 5 or 6 or 7 arguments where it was like, once you hear these, you're going to be in forever because they're foolproof. And I heard them, from the best of the best, and I was sitting there going like, these are not good arguments, right? And I didn't have any philosophical training. I was just a 17-year-old kid, but common sense wise, it did not resonate for me. And so, yeah, I know that didn't directly answer your question, but I think that's more what happened, is that I recognized that the arguments weren't good.
I think that does answer the question. And so kind of moving along to the next chapter. So now you're out, but you're also 17. And I want to kind of throw in, you had a reputation at the time of being a troublemaker, not necessarily intentionally, but that's how you were. And I'm even curious how that even fit in. So what was life like at that point?
As I was leaving?
So you've decided you're out, but you're also still 17, and you're surrounded by religious people. And what's next for Mike?
Yeah, it was a very intense journey, because not only was I the first one in the family to do this, I came out of the gate blazing, in the sense that I wasn't trying to cause trouble. I really wasn't. But I also, just my personality is that I never hide what I believe about things, for better or worse. I think mostly for better. As much as a lot of people would have preferred that I leave and say, yeah, this isn't quite for me, this isn't quite my lifestyle, but still acknowledge that it's true. That wasn't how it happened for me, so I didn't lie. And I just said, I declared I'm an atheist. And I wasn't shy about that. And I think that just made the whole thing extra dramatic, because I was also the first one, and I was also coming out completely disavowing the whole thing from a philosophical point of view. I wasn't just saying I don't fit in. So it caused a lot of chaos, particularly with the parents. They reacted very negatively, so it was not a fun period of time. Looking back, I'm proud of my younger self, maybe I'd say, that he stuck to it and just stuck to his conviction, even though I was being told by everyone around me that I'm wrong, or that I'm bad, or that I'm doing this for the wrong reasons. There was plenty of that to go around. And so I think I was just so sure that there was no amount of that kind of gaslighting that would have done much. So it was pretty intense in that sense. On the other hand, I'm very grateful that I met a core group of kids who were very much in the similar boat to me. There was this core group of just guys around my age, not even from that I grew up in. I just met them around town or through mutual friends and stuff. And I became part of this group of guys that were all some version of what I was doing, which was grew up very religious and are not exactly living by it. It's not that we were all declared atheists, but we were all outside of the mold. And so we would get drinks together and we'd go out and party and we would have fun. I think having that community was really, really important, because it meant that I had people that I could be around. And I mean, even those people often judged me for how hardcore I was. That's the funny thing. Even these kids who are not being bad Jewish kids would still make a face or say something about the fact that I'm an atheist. It was still kind of dramatic, but there was a lot more space there for me to just be who I am. And so I think that was really important. In terms of your question about being a troublemaker, I was doing pretty, I think, standard teenage things. I was drinking, I was partying. I wasn't doing anything crazy. I think part of what happened is that there was this narrative, in order to protect the rest of the siblings from following suit. It was a very convenient narrative to cast me out as the black sheep, right? And say, Mike's just a troublemaker. Mike's doing this because he wants to be with girls. Mike's doing this for all the wrong reasons. And then that, I think, was an attempt to protect. Didn't quite work out, as we know today. But I think it's a pretty rational way to try to make sure people don't follow suit. And I'll add to that there's also a psychological component to it, because it allows people to still feel good about their own set of beliefs, because they can write off my new approach as just horniness, essentially. Like my entire philosophical worldview comes down to the fact that I just want to be with girls. So I don't really have to engage with him. I don't have to find it threatening. I can just be, yeah, this is a kid who wants to be with girls. So I guess I was a troublemaker to some extent, but I think a big part of the reputation that you speak about, which I definitely had, was also completely manufactured and not fair to what I was doing.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. And I wanted to elaborate further on that. I remember at that time, it was such a novel thing when you would encounter some kid from the neighborhood, maybe he wasn't even from your school, who had left religion. And then you would walk by and you'd see him sitting on some bench on Friday night and he wasn't even wearing a kippah. And he would be eating like sunflower seeds, or worse, he would be on his phone. And there was this like hushed tones of what has happened to him. It's as if he was doing drugs under a bridge. And in fact, that was part of the narrative, that he probably was doing drugs under the bridge when you weren't looking. And that kind of, and I remember really viscerally feeling that way towards all the off the derech kids who are like 17, because I left much later in life. And so I'm curious, as an insider, what was it like back then? Like there's this reputation of here's a part of it more nuanced. There was this real reputation. Everybody there is unhappy, which could be true. But then the thing, why are they unhappy? Because they've left religion, right? That was always the crux of the argument that was made.
Right. And there's so many contradictions there that I find amusing at this point. It's like we're told that we shouldn't be religious in order to be happy, because that's really not what's important, right? On the one hand. And then, but the whole happiness thing is totally weaponized when it works in favor of the narrative, right? So there's so much of that stuff that goes on. In terms of being on the receiving end of that, I will say, given our background and everything, I was not particularly emotionally in touch. And probably for good reason, right? I don't think I necessarily would have made it through that whole period if I wasn't a little numb. And, so I think I wasn't really confronting it fully in the way that I would have needed to in order to process it. And I'm doing a lot of that work now, a decade later, really kind of feeling the pain of that. So I think it was a lot more painful than I felt at the time, if that makes sense. But there was also this sense of, I think that even back then, even when I was 17, 18, I had a recognition that this is not my stuff. It was clear to me that stuff is being put on me that says more about the people that are putting it on me than it does about me. I don't know if I would have had the language for it that I have now, but I think intuitively I understood that the response here doesn't quite match what's going on. And so this is not really my problem. So I didn't really, it never caused me, not for a second, caused me to doubt the new path that I was on, right? It was uncomfortable and it led to a lot of drama at home, and it made the home environment very unpleasant. It was very uncomfortable, but it never caused me to think, oh, maybe they're right. Maybe I shouldn't be doing this. Maybe I am doing this for the wrong reasons, or even maybe I should go back because at least I won't have to deal with all of this backlash. None of those types of things came up, like even for a split second. That was never an option. So it was like, okay, I guess this is what I have to deal with now, but there's no other path here. And I think that clarity helped me move through it. Because if there was more doubt from me, I think it would have been a lot more challenging to stay the course when you're dealing with all this shit and you're not sure if you're going in the right direction, right? That combination of those two things, I think, would have been confusing.
Right. How do you feel about some of your friends who you've seen over the years maybe become more religious again?
I understand it. I think for a lot of people, the comfort and the community that you get from being religious is so enticing that it's hard to resist that for too long. And so it's a pretty common trajectory for people to leave for a bit, have their fun, do some partying, and then 1 year, 2 years, 5 years down the line, they come back. And I don't judge it because I understand the needs that are being met there. I don't think it's the most, there's something there that lacks in some integrity to me, and it would never work for me. But I also think, again, this goes back to the why did you leave question. If people didn't leave for a very intellectual reason, then there isn't much reason not to go back, right? If you always believed in God, this is very common. People leave religion, but they always believe in God. They might even say something like, I really think I should be living that way. I just don't want to right now. Kind of like, I think I should be vegan, but I'm not. So some people do the same thing with religion where they think that it's the right way to go, but they just don't do it. So for them to come back to it is a pretty consistent position to have, right? They're just saying, I'm coming back to the way that I always thought I should be in. If someone declares himself an atheist and is out for a few years and then goes back, that to me is a bit of an intellectually dishonest thing to do. And at the same time, I see why. I mean, this is, you know this as well as I do, that leaving religion behind is an incredibly daunting thing to do. And it takes a lot of courage. And you're stepping into the unknown and you have no idea how it's going to unfold. And there's so many things you need to learn about the world outside that no one taught you. So I have no judgment for people who choose not to do that. Even though, generally speaking, I think people are better off for it, right? I have a pretty strong conviction that if you make it through the choppy waters initially, you end up in a better place. I'm not saying this is true across the board, but I think it's true for a lot of people. But I also understand why someone might not want to go through those choppy waters, and fair enough.
Yeah, very cool. And so continuing on that line, is there anything that you miss from religion, considering especially how intellectual and how resolute your journey out was?
That's a very interesting question because my initial answer is no. Not because I don't miss certain aspects. It's more that it was such a package of pain that it's hard for me to draw out any of the threads that might have been positive because it's all so intertwined with negative stuff. If I dwell on it for a moment, I would say probably something along the lines of the community aspect. I think there is something about the way people form community around religion that is hard to replicate. There's something about how dramatic the narrative is and how shared the beliefs are, where people really come together and support each other. And in the secular context, you can create community, but it just doesn't have the same robustness necessarily, or at least it requires more effort. And so I actually think this is a big reason people are religious. And I think a big reason why people become religious is because of the promise of community. It's such a core human need. So if I had to say that I missed something, I would say community. But I don't actually stand behind that too much because I don't love the type of community that was, and I don't love all the other negative things that came with it. And I also feel like I've been able to foster my own community spaces here in the US as a secular person. I don't miss anything about being religious.
Yeah. Okay. Very cool. And so what was the journey, the final journey out, right? You've made the decision. There's the initial, as you called, like choppy waters. And I know with your case that lasted for a good few years. What was the other side like?
The other side was intimidating and daunting and foreign. And there was a lot of finding myself and recreating my identity and figuring out who I am and what I'm about. So it's a real reconstruction of everything you knew to be true. And, it's not a simple thing to move through. But I think to me, the freedom there was so palpable. The fact that finally, for the first time, after almost 2 decades, I can live my life the way I want to and believe the things I want to and do the things that I want to and just follow my own intuition on things. That was so liberating that it made everything else worth it, right? And I think a big moment for me was joining the Israeli military, actually, because that was my first time where I was in a completely secular environment. And there were religious people in my unit, but it's a secular institution. And I met real secular Israelis for the first time ever. And I went in as a secular kid. No one even knew that unless I told people, which I did, but and there was nothing about me that seemed orthodox. I was completely secular once I started. So that was a real fresh start for me. And my military service was fraught with difficulty. But one thing that it did that I think was very positive is it allowed me to really reconstruct my identity in Israel as a secular person, meet real secular Jews and Israelis and get to know them. And essentially really escape. Because that period that I was in that I mentioned earlier, it was still a very weirdly religious space. I was hanging out with ex-religious kids. So you're still kind of like tethered to that world. Even though you're clawing yourself out, you're still people who come from the same families and talk the same language. So that wasn't a real escape. it was really good for me to have that community, but it wasn't a real escape. I think joining the military was a real fresh start. And then moving to the US after that and traveling and everything. But I think my big move out in terms of how my life looked pragmatically was joining the military.
I literally was religious. And then for 1 year in Israel, I was like ex-religious, which is exactly the phase you were in for several years. And I was very much like every person, hi, I'm Shalom Tzvi. I used to be religious. Like that was the introduction.
Yeah.
That was the identity. And it stuck with me for a while, probably to some degree, but then I just left Israel. So there really was never, there was a complete alienation from Israeli society as a whole, larger. Like I only know of Israel as like fucking Masharim and Gula and religious neighborhoods basically. And then this foreign land called Tel Aviv where I would go every couple of weeks for a weekend.
Yeah, and because your military service was also in a religious context.
I was religious, very deeply religious at the time still. And it was
Right.
not, it was intended to, I tried to get a taste for a broader Israeli society and that backfired in my face and I ended up in an ultra-orthodox Israeli unit. So I'm curious very broadly with all that you've been through, and I think I might know some of the answers, but what has helped you heal over the years? What's helped you heal? What's helped you build community, which you alluded to before?
I would say the biggest thing for me has been meditation. I got into meditation pretty soon after I got out of the army, and I was immediately hooked on it and did it very seriously, doing meditation retreats. And I've been doing that for almost a decade now. And there's something about the type of meditation that I practice that allows for unresolved stuff to come up and move through the system. And so it's incredibly intense and very, very painful and also extremely, extremely healing. So that's an ongoing process for me. I've come to see that our system knows how to heal as long as you put the right conditions in place. And so I think meditation is one way of doing that, where you're creating a non-judgmental, open space in yourself where stuff can come out. Therapy was also very important for me, just to kind of connect the dots and work through stuff. And also psychedelics. Actually, psychedelics is the reason I got into meditation to begin with. I did psychedelics while I was still in the army. On weekends, I would go to festivals in Israel and do psychedelics, and that completely blew my mind and opened me up to ways of being that I had not knew were possible. And then once I encountered meditation, because I had those intense psychedelic experiences, the prospect of meditation was incredibly intriguing to me. So I really credit psychedelics for a lot of my path. And to this day, I still utilize it in a very therapeutic way. And I think the combination of meditation and psychedelics can be incredibly powerful. And here I should issue all the caveats about psychedelics, not endorsing doing it. Be careful. It's your own judgment. I think psychedelics can also be very intense for people. So I'm not advocating for everyone going out and do it. But for me, it's been a really important part of healing. And then to your question about community, yeah, that I think is a challenge to do when you move to a new place and people already have their friend and you're from a different culture, and that can be very isolating. And that is an ongoing journey for me. I think the main thing that I've done that really makes a difference is when I meet my people, I don't let them go, right? And not in a stalk their home kind of way, but in a, hey, let's foster a relationship here. And so I think I am able to do that, and that's allowed me to meet some really incredible people. And we don't necessarily live locally, but we have relationships and we'll meet up whenever we can, and that really sustains me. And it requires maintenance. So I guess my short form answer is relationship maintenance is the way to create community. You have to nourish relationships. Relationships require care. And I think that's something over the years that I've become very clear on, is that's one of my biggest priorities in life, is to care for and sustain and maintain and nourish the relationships with the people that I love.
Nice. Awesome. I'm curious if you could briefly elaborate on how psychedelics led to meditation, because in my mind, psychedelics is a lot easier than meditation. Not saying that it doesn't have its risks, but like I oftentimes kind of make it conditional when I do a drug trip to have meditated for a little while beforehand, a few days at least, so that I'm not just getting the easy way out, and to show that like I am willing to do the work, because sitting with yourself sober is way harder than all the feel good stuff, and then stuff comes up. But I'm curious how the path that way. If you told me you did meditation and then you got into psychedelics, that I hear, right? But psychedelics to meditation, could you talk more about that?
Yeah, I think that the reason that it was impactful is because if I had encountered meditation just right off the bat, especially with our religious upbringing and me being incredibly skeptical about all things spirituality, I think there's a good chance that I would have written off the whole thing as just more new age, woo woo. I was very much in this atheist, skeptical way of thinking and being. And so the thing that the psychedelics did is psychedelics don't care about my skepticism. Psychedelics just blow your mind open and just shatter perspectives. I was doing it completely recreationally. I was doing it to party. I had no intention of exploring consciousness or, what the nature of identity. None of that. I was trying to have fun. But I accidentally stumbled into a completely radical space. And I think over and over and over again, as I was doing that, it was melting something away in me. So that when I first read a book about meditation, it just clicked and this fire was lit and also I should say that the book I read specifically drew parallels between psychedelics and meditation. So it was an actually explicit connection that was made between the two. And that's all I needed was to read that book and have a connection made to psychedelics, and all of those experiences that I had had made me thirsty for something more. I was really yearning for something more, and so the ground was prepped for me to be interested. At the very least, I don't think I would have been on fire about it the way I was. Like, I was really on fire about meditation before I even meditated once. I just loved everything that it was about before I did it. So that I really credit psychedelics for.
Interesting.
It opened something in me.
What was the book?
The book was Waking Up by Sam Harris.
Okay, so he draws parallels to that. Okay, cool.
And that was also very fortuitous that he wrote that book, because he is a hard line atheist, no BS kind of guy. He impacted me a lot in my journey out of religion. He's one of the new atheists that I mentioned earlier. And so I think it was perfect that he wrote this book, because I already had so much respect for him as an intellectual. And I knew that he's the last person to take on unfounded beliefs. So I was going to be the most receptive to someone like him pitching meditation, as opposed to, pick your new age guru name. So that was also really, I think, cool that he ended up being my conduit into meditation, because I was much more receptive to his message and also his way of talking about it that I don't know if I would have been otherwise.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm curious, this is a bit of a side question. Why is it then that so few people who start on recreational drugs don't end up meditating? Like, I honestly, I'm not surprised. Like, my assumption was if you do recreational, you're going to stay recreational. You have to be very deliberate about it. I'm curious, what do you think the factors were that even though you were doing, drugs recreationally, that it still ended up going that way? And I think you may have alluded to, you were looking for something more at the same time. So maybe it was that.
There were people that I was tripping with at the time that were my festival crew that I went to. We were doing the same drugs at the same place over and over again. And they would not be interested in something like meditation. And they didn't see psychedelics as anything more than a good time. So I don't really know to say why for me, it kind of morphed into a more existential, spiritual, kind of contemplative pursuit. I'm not sure. There's probably a million different factors, personality, background. But I think for me, it was just like the psychedelic state was incredibly, dancing to psytrance at festivals on psychedelics was incredibly enjoyable. And that's why I kept doing it over and over again. But it quickly became clear that that's not all that it was. There was something about that state of mind that was just incredible and so different and so just drenched with meaning. And so it took me a while too, right? It wasn't my first trip necessarily, but I think the more I got used to being in that place, I remember I would spend the weeks in the military just waiting for my next trip. Those states of mind were so beautiful. It became like what I live for. I just wanted more of that, and not in an addictive kind of way. It was just I think a very deep part of me that was being woken up that wanted more. That's how I tend to think about it. So short answer, I don't really know why some people take it to a more spiritual place and others don't. But I'm very grateful that for me, that's how it unfolded.
Yeah. Awesome. So the last few questions for you. So first one is, you've hyped meditation up so much. I think some of the people listening might be curious more about it. And I get asked this fairly regularly, and you probably get asked it way more. If somebody is interested in starting to learn how to meditate or to do meditation, what would be your recommendation to them?
I would say starting with an app is a great way to go because it creates structure around it and gives you the concepts that are necessary. There are a few apps that I think are very good, are my go-to recommendations. Headspace is solid. A lot of people have heard of it. That's great for learning the basics. It's a beautifully designed app and it can teach you the foundations of mindfulness meditation. I'm also a big fan of Sam's app, Waking Up, which I think is really good at taking people to deeper sides of meditation, stuff that's not necessarily available in other apps. But I actually think the most important thing is to actually just do it, and everything else just falls into place afterwards. So my biggest recommendation for people is to build a habit of it. Even if it's just 5 minutes a day, doing it consistently over time is the biggest thing. And which app you're using and whatnot, those are interesting things and it matters, but none of that matters if you're not actually meditating. So, yeah.
The classic trap of talking about it, as if you're preparing to buy the perfect sneakers for your tennis match. And so you're doing everything but.
Right. You're getting all the bike gear and doing the research. I think actually sitting down and doing it is the most important thing. And you don't need to do, I think a lot of people get caught in this trap where they feel like they have to do a certain amount of time, like they have to meditate 20 minutes or half an hour a day. And if they're not doing that, might as well not do it. And so my go-to thing that I say to people now is it's way better to do 1 minute every day than not do it at all. You know, yeah. the returns on the difference between 0 and 1 is huge compared to 1 and 5 or 5 and 10, right? I think there's probably a name for this. This is true for a lot of domains, right? Yeah. Where you get the most returns between doing the thing or not doing it.
It's the infinite improvement.
Right. So I think there's something about people like getting permission to not have to do long sessions seems to be really useful for a lot of people. I can just sit for a minute. I don't have to, be a yogi now that sits for 3 days in a cave without eating in order to accomplish this.
Right. Right. And what would be your advice to your younger self in general, considering the very tumultuous arc that you went through? Would there be anything that retroactively you would do differently?
It's interesting. My advice for my past self, not much comes to mind because I think alluding to this earlier, I appreciate the way I went about it. I was so clear on my next move and I didn't let anyone deter me from that. And so I don't know that I would have a ton of advice beyond maybe the kind of cliche, just know that nothing's forever kind of thing, just kind of giving me perspective that things could look very different down the line. Maybe that's what I would say. In terms of one thing I would do differently, I think I would have moved out of the house. Yep, that's become very clear to me. And it's one of my regrets about that period. And in fact, this might be a little tangential, but during my days in the military, I started applying for what's called the Khayal Boded, the lone soldier status, where the military will recognize you as a lone soldier and give you a bunch of money, like way more money than you would get as a regular soldier, and also provide housing and everything. And I know that I would have qualified if I had really pushed for it because of people in a similar situation or even better circumstances qualified. And what happened was I started going down that route and I told our mother about that and she freaked out and took it very personally and was really making me feel bad about it. And I couldn't stand that. So I decided to withdraw my application. And looking back, that was a big mistake. I wish I had gone forward, even though it was causing her pain, because that's not my responsibility. And I deserve that support. And I ended up I got into debt during my time in the military and I had to take off breaks to work, and all of that would have been dealt with. And I think just being in an environment that wasn't so judgmental and harsh would have been very good for my well-being. So yes, one thing I would do differently is get out of the house, because it's crazy that I lived in the house for basically 4 or 5 years after leaving religion. I still lived at home. I was in the military, so I wasn't spending a ton of time at home, but I was still living at home. Like that was my home base.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think it's cool that for a lot of the other siblings, they did end up getting out pretty soon after leaving the religion. And that strikes me as a much healthier arrangement.
I left religion and moved back in. That was
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that was my smart move. So one final question: with all of that and the conviction and the way that you did it, and overall you stand by what you did, what would be your advice to other people in the same situation? And you know
Yeah,
what? I'll expand it because I know a lot of what you've already said really touches upon it. You know, the words you'd say. So I'll invite you to add, especially you, because you're very well resourced. Anything from books, movies, songs, YouTube channels, anything like that that you want to throw out here is welcome as well.
I think a big piece of advice for me would be to find community. And that's really easier said than done. I recognize that. But I think that that's one of the things that's hardest about leaving any type of religion behind is the loss of community. And so I think to the extent that you can create new community, it makes the whole transition way more manageable. You can go about that in so many ways. It doesn't even have to be, it could be virtual communities. Reddit is a great place to find like-minded people. There's a whole ex-Jew subreddit that I know you're familiar with. That can be a great place. You can talk about stuff. You can connect with people. If you can find people locally, even better. But I think finding some people that understand what you're going through and can support you in it is a huge, huge piece. And then I think just a reminder, I mean, I don't know if this is advice as much as it is kind of like a framing, but I think that it's helpful to remember that these are lifelong decisions, right? You have one life and you get to live however you want. And so viewing it from that perspective, I find that it can put some of the initial challenges into a more long-term view where I'm doing this not for the next year, I'm doing this for the rest of my life. I'm leaving this religion now and it's going to be painful, but I'm going to be getting compounding interest on this decision and dividends down the line for the rest of my life. And the alternative is I stay boxed in for the rest of my life. These are lifelong forks in the road. And so I think remembering that can help move through the hard times because you realize that it's just a rite of passage on the way to hopefully, and I think likely, a better life on the other side, right? I still look back at that, at my leaving as the best thing I ever did, bar none, right? There's no other decision that is second to that. There are a lot of other things I'm very proud of, but leaving religion at 17 is the best thing I ever done. And I'm so grateful to my past self for sticking it out. And so I think remembering that in the moment can be helpful.
That's really cool. There's always that point, right, of how it gets harder with age. Like I imagine our mother, sometimes I wonder if she's really aligned anymore with religion. But it's like the sunk cost fallacy. It's like, where are you going to go? Right? You're in your 60s. And people do leave. And I think if they do leave at that age, it's actually extra courageous. I know a guy who did that, and he left his kids and grandkids behind because they all think he's crazy now and won't talk to him. So when you do that, it's amazing. At any age, they say this about investing, right? When's the time to invest is now, right? And don't get caught up about the past, but definitely don't wait till the future.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I'll say, even with us, I view your decision to leave as so brave. And I recognize that you had to deal with so many things that I didn't because you did it later on. You had a family and kids. And it's a whole other domain that you have to work through. And I'm so proud of the fact that you did that. And I also am grateful that I did it earlier and I avoided those things. And so I think we're like a good example of the difference in time, right? You wait 5 years more and
You got 5 more kids.
right, exactly. Yeah. It's short-term comfort, but overall stalling is, yeah, I just don't think that it ends up making sense if you're clear on the next step,
Yeah. So with that, I welcome you if you have any questions for me.
Who's your favorite sibling? No, I'm joking. We know.
Yeah, I could tell you, but then I'd have to kill you.
Right. I guess maybe this is too niche to our family, but I'm curious if you're learning anything by talking to us.
It's a good question. Yeah. And it's been only you and Sim so far.
Right.
I would say off the top of my head that it's almost like we've spoken about all these things 1,000 times, and at the very least, this is another conversation, right? So it's like there's always something to be gleaned from re-exploring the same thing, even from like a slightly different angle. So the one thing that immediately comes to my mind. And the second is that the slightly more structured structure of a podcast is that there's like a beginning and a middle and an end. And so it kind of allows for a conversation that probably is more organized and fills in maybe some blanks along the way, and really like almost systemically addresses like the same questions over and over again. So I think to that degree, what comes to mind right now is even how important the army was for you. I think I knew that, but it kind of articulated it more. The value of community. I knew you were hanging out with friends. I didn't realize you valued it to that degree, right? So nuances like that. Or, I think maybe I've always wondered, I don't know if we've ever spoken about if there's things that you miss from that life or not, right? So sometimes hearing it kind of stated overtly instead of implied that I've already figured it out, it's nice to kind of get that arc. Yeah, I'm curious the same thing, when I eventually do an interview, and you listen to it, I'm curious if you'll find anything new that you didn't already know.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I will, and that's why I would love for you to interview everyone in the family. I don't know if anyone else would be interested in hearing that, but I definitely would, because even just listening to the episode with Sim, I feel like I learned a lot of new things about his background, or at the very least, kind of like you say, it puts things into sharper perspective. Things are stated more clearly. And so I love it. I guess another question I have for you is, what is a particular challenge that you had to work through or overcome when it comes to leaving religion when you already have a family?
So the family perspective, it's the lack of freedom. It's very, very fundamental almost. But if you think of leaving religion as a journey towards freedom, from oppression to freedom, the true exodus, which is literally in this podcast's subtitle. And so you're doing that and you're ready for it all. You're like, bring it. But then you look behind you and there's this chain around your ankle, right? And it's the reality of everything that you cannot walk away from. And so now you have to pick up this ball and chain and escape at your prison break at the speed that you can. I like that metaphor. And it's basically, yeah, I've made a lot of progress in life, but damn if I wouldn't have loved to visit a bunch more countries. And so all of these side repercussions that will tie you back in, it's like a gravitational pull. And it wasn't strong enough to really keep me religious. That wasn't even a factor, maybe similar to yours. Like I was done. But nonetheless, it's like, let's say if I had left a wife who remained religious, right? I know all these people who are closeted atheists who still maintain a family because they don't want to leave their kids. So they act like they're religious themselves. It opens up a whole world of accessing your freedom. And if you want to go conspiracy theory, or like the real wisdom of self-preservation of religion, is when it gets people to get married super young and have kids, they're locked in. Boom. And the earlier you can do it, the more they have sold their soul to God or whatever it is that they're doing. And that's it. It becomes so much harder to leave with each child. The movie One of Us, right? Where he has to leave his 3 kids behind and he's literally not in contact with them. Those are the extreme stories. And one of the most fortunate cases, one of the best possible scenarios that you could imagine for someone leaving religion. I had to live in another country alone. I had to work for Orthodox Jews for years. I still navigate the lack of freedom every day. I live in a city I don't want to live in. It would have been good for me to be around Footsteps in New York for a while. I should have moved to New York and hung around with Footsteps all day long instead of in Hamilton, Ontario. And I don't have a single friend here, right? So there are all those aspects that they come back to bite you. I look at you guys with the freedoms that you have, and I'm definitely jealous. You almost find yourself more fully and more quickly. It's like you can't, like Aviva and I talk about meditation. Aviva would love to meditate for probably a year straight right now to deal with her trauma. But we deal with our trauma on weekend breaks while then going back to deal with the kids who are the product of our trauma. That's how we ended up in this situation in the first place. And so now we get these little snippets where we get to work on ourselves a bit here and there. And so that's one of the aspects.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense to me. And I think that visual of breaking out of prison with a chain is really striking. And it's kind of, it's like you're saying what I was speaking to earlier about completely remaking yourself or reinventing yourself, and the freedom in that is what's lacking, at least to a very great extent, when you have a family that you have to. There's just like, there's always constraints, right? You're never fully free to do anything. Like that's the reality.
Right.
I also can speak to many constraints that I had, but I can totally understand. Yeah, I actually think my parallel experience of this might be a weird analogy, but I think I tasted that in the army, weirdly enough. I joined the army voluntarily, but then once you're in, you can't leave. And I felt very viscerally what it's like to lack so many freedoms that you take for granted, and there's nothing you can do about it. And it's extremely stifling. and frustrating. And obviously, in the Army case, it's time limited. Once 3 years pass by, you get to leave. But yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. Thank you for sharing of a situation, right? Like the beginning wasn't ideal, but then figuring out, all right, what's the best way that we can go about this for everyone involved? And I feel like you guys have done such an amazing job of that. So kudos.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Awesome, Mike.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Beyond Belief. If you found the episode inspiring, please share it with others who might benefit from it, and be sure to subscribe to it to get updates about future episodes.